Now today it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Dan Smith, visiting us from Harvard University. He left his home around 3 a.m. or something and made a very hectic early morning trip to arrive here to make it to this talk. He is Associate Professor at the Department of Government at Harvard University. He finished his PhD at University of California, San Diego in 2012. So he's climbing up the stairs to stardom very quickly, and he's definitely a rising star in the field of political science broadly and electoral politics in Japan specifically. He has published a number of articles already in prominent social science journals, political science journals, and I should mention that today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Center for Global Partnership of the Japan Foundation, and Dan and I first met through their program called Mansfield U.S.-Japan Network for the Future. So we got to spend a week, I don't know, in total probably about 4 weeks in the wilderness of Montana and the islands of Okinawa and with bureaucrats in Tokyo and so on. So I got to know him quite well. He's a fun person to be around, and I also know about he's a classically trained musician, singer. But I also know his penchant for Japanese enka songs, enka being country music in Japan. He doesn't mean Hikawa Kiyoshi, if you know anything about Hikawa Kiyoshi. So we spent some time in karaoke rooms in Japan too. So he's going to talk about dynasties, political dynasties in Japan. His brother is also Nate Smith. He's also a Japan social scientist. He's an anthropologist at the University of Arizona. So his family is building a dynasty in Japan studies, so to speak. When I was hanging out with the brothers, I tried to pass as a third brother Smith because we kind of look alike. Right? Yeah. Didn't work, but it's always a pleasure to hang out with Dan. And today we have the pleasure of getting a sneak preview of his forthcoming book. It's in print, I'd imagine. It's
in
coming
July.
out in July 2018. The book is titled Dynasties and Democracy, The Inherited Incumbency Advantage in Japan. It's coming out from Stanford University Press in the summer of 2018. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Dan Smith.
I think I don't need a microphone, right? Am I on? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kyo, and thanks to the Center for Japanese Studies and CGP. I'm delighted to be here. This is actually my first time visiting Michigan, and also, obviously, the first time visiting this beautiful new building. So if you can't see me here are my slides here. They're on this TV and that TV. This is a very technologically exciting room, and so hopefully you enjoy the presentation. As Kyo mentioned, my name is Dan Smith, Associate Professor at Harvard. My brother and I were both hired into our positions at the same time, so there's no dynasty there. My definition of dynasty for the political context is that the senior member has to precede the junior member into politics, so we don't count. But maybe if we have offspring who go into academia, then they would count. So, starting with definitions, what is a democratic dynasty, what I call a dynasty? So dynasties are common in monarchical regimes or personal dictatorships. Democracy should be the antithesis to dynastic rule for political selection. So I define a democratic dynasty as any family in which two or more members have held elected national office. I focus on national office for reasons of data reliability and codability, but you could consider dynastic ties to local level offices. For the purposes of this talk, we'll focus on national office. And so these kinds of dynasties are prominent and well known throughout the world. Some examples from the United States. The very first dynasty is the Adams dynasty. The Kennedys are well known, the Clintons and the Bushes are well known. Basically, if you have a politician, in this hypothetical example, we'll call him Senator Jones, and he has an offspring, a family relative related by blood or marriage, who later runs for office and is elected. Running for office would make that candidate a legacy candidate. In Japanese, this is sometimes called a nisei Gin if they're elected, or a kohosha if they're running. This is a candidate who's related to a previously elected politician. Another subset of legacy candidates are those who immediately run in the same district to succeed their predecessor in the next election. So the father, say, retires or dies, and the son runs in the same district. So in this case, Senator Jones retires or dies, and his son runs in the next election. That would be a hereditary candidate. In Japanese, this is sometimes called a sesshu kohosha or gin if they're elected. And these distinctions will become important later in the talk. Okay, why study this type of democratic dynasty? Well, for one, we might have normative concerns about democratic inequality. Democracy should equal the right for anybody, barring some minor restrictions, to run for office. All men are created equal. If we see that actually among representatives, it doesn't appear that all men are created equal. Some families are more equal than others. That might raise some normative concerns. We might have substantive concerns about the quality of representation. If families are entrenched in politics, maybe they have less reason or need to respond to voters' demands. The cross-national, cross-temporal, and cross-party variation that exists around the world is a puzzle. Why are there more dynasties in some countries like Japan than in other countries like Germany, say? And understanding how dynasties arise and their impact in developed democracies like Japan can also provide solutions or insight for developing democracies where democratic dynasties are perceived as a problem. So there are lots of dynasties in India, Thailand, Peru, and the Philippines, for example. Okay, so I gave some examples of dynasties in the U.S. In actuality, dynasties in the U.S. have been declining over time. So in the early decades of American democracy, they reached almost up to 20% of the House of Representatives, even more in the Senate, but have slowly declined to less than 10% in recent years. Here's Japan. Democracy started in 1947, and the share of dynasties in the House of Representatives rapidly climbed to a peak of over 30% in the early 1990s. It dropped precipitously in 2009 when the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, lost power for the first time since a brief interlude in 1993, 1994, but really the first time since 1955 when the party was founded that it was no longer the largest party. And then when the LDP came back into power in 2012, there was a rebound in dynasties. If we look comparatively across countries, Japan is one of the most dynastic democracies in the world, just shy of the percentage of dynasties in Thailand, the Philippines, and Iceland. And Iceland is sort of a weird outlier. There are 320,000 people in Iceland, so just about everybody's related in some way or another. It's not surprising that in their parliament there would be lots of relations of marriage and family as well. In fact, this is their parliament building, and there's such little security that even shady characters like this, that's me, can get right up next to the parliament building in downtown Reykjavik. So Japan is an outlier among large democratic OECD developed democracies. If we look at patterns over time as well, in most countries there's a decline over time. You might expect this. More people are getting engaged in politics, including running for office, and the old aristocratic elite are slowly shuffled out of political dominance. An exception is Ireland, which has had a lot of dynasties. It's actually very similar to Japan. And here's Japan. Sticks out. It doesn't seem to be following the pattern that we see in most other democracies. So what's going on? If we look at parties, there's also large differences between Japan's parties and other democracies. In some democracies like Germany, there are less than 5% of members of different parties are from political families. Ireland, up to 35% in Fianna Fáil, the conservative, long-time ruling party. And here's Japan, reaches 40% in the LDP. This is your party, which is formed by defectors from the LDP. So essentially, it's a small version of the LDP. Okay? But the cross-party variation also raises the question of why is the LDP more dynastic than other parties? It can't be something about Japan historically or culturally that's Japan-specific. There must be something else going on at the party level that explains why there are so many dynasties in Japan. Okay, so why do we want to focus on Japan? For one, there are lots of dynasties. They stick out in sort of an odd outlier. But it's also become a controversial issue since the late 2000s. The Democratic Party of Japan, prior to its dissolution, pledged not to nominate any new hereditary candidate beginning in 2009. In contrast, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan continued to nominate some, including the son of former Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro, pictured to the right. And as I mentioned, Japan has an unusually high proportion of dynasties, both in parliament and in their cabinet. 5 of the most recent 7 prime ministers have been from dynasties. And as we'll see, the share of cabinet ministers who come from dynasties is also disproportionately large. Okay? More importantly, from an analytical perspective, electoral reform in 1994 and party reforms in the 2000s allow us to gain some leverage on the influence of institutions on the practice of hereditary recruitment. So we're using Japan as a sort of natural experiment within country case to examine how institutions shape behavior for recruiting dynastic politicians. Okay? This just illustrates that we can plausibly consider the electoral reform in 1994 as being unrelated to the controversy surrounding dynasties. These are mentions in Asahi newspaper of the word sesshu. So some of them include topics like the emperor. But it's a rough proxy for the importance of the issue of hereditary politics in Japan. And you can see that there are spikes around election time, a huge spike in 2009. But all of these were after electoral reform. So it's not the case that electoral reform in 1994 was pushed forward because of a perceived issue in dynastic politics. So it's not an endogenously chosen electoral reform to deal with dynastic politics. So if we see any changes in the practice of hereditary recruitment, we can attribute that to the electoral system and not to the motivations for the electoral system. Okay. What are the puzzles in a research agenda in this project? First, what explains the variation in dynastic politics across time and space, so countries and parties? Why have dynasties persisted and grown in number in Japan, despite Japan having free and fair elections, despite economic growth and modernization, and despite a large population of potential alternative candidates? So it's not Iceland here. It's a big country. There are lots of people who could be running for office, and they just aren't. My key empirical questions are, do institutional factors contribute to the emergence or continuance of dynasties and democracies? Do legacy candidates enjoy an inherited advantage in politics? And if so, how large is the advantage? And finally, does a high percentage of dynasties lower the quality of democracy? So these are the questions that I tackle in my book, which Kyo mentioned is coming out next July. I just last week got the cover design, so this is a sneak preview of what the book will look like. More or less, maybe we'll tweak some things. We'll find out. To briefly foreshadow my argument, I argue that members of political dynasties enjoy what I call an inherited incumbency advantage. And that is defined as the advantages that are enjoyed by a new legacy candidate as a result of his or her family ties to a previous politician. It's analogous to the well-studied and well-known incumbency advantage, which are the advantages that incumbents enjoy in elections. And it's assumed to be no larger or no stronger than the predecessor's actual incumbency advantage. Okay. Variation across countries and parties can be explained by supply and demand. On the supply side, I argue that the children and other relatives of long-serving politicians will be more likely to want to seek out a career in politics. This is no different than children of dentists wanting to become dentists or children of doctors wanting to become doctors and so on. Some children of politicians are going to see a career in politics for themselves. And this may be especially true if the family has multiple generations in politics. So if your father was a politician, but also your grandfather was a politician, then there may be a higher supply side incentive for you to also want to become a politician. But I assume that this applies across all contexts. So there's nothing about Japan in particular that makes sons or daughters or other relatives more likely to want to run for office compared to Germany or Ireland or any other country. Across all countries, there should be this supply side effect of children of long-time serving incumbents also wanting to become politicians. So to look at variation across parties and across countries, we have to consider the demand side of the equation. I argue that party actors involved in candidate selection will be more likely to want to seek out a legacy candidate when the value of the inherited incumbency advantage is perceived to be higher for the party. Okay? And this means that when the value or the perceived value of the inherited incumbency advantage is high, party actors will favor even the relatives of relatively weak incumbents or relatively weak former incumbents. Okay. Where do institutions come in? Institutional factors can increase the value of the inherited incumbency advantage. So one important variable, I argue, is that elections that shape or structure competition around individual candidates and their characteristics, so candidate-centered elections, will increase the value of the inherited incumbency advantage as a personal vote-earning attribute, in contrast to a party label that earns votes based on the party's platform or policies. The personal vote can be defined as a candidate's electoral support which originates in his or her personal qualities, qualifications, activities, and record. Okay? When the personal vote is important for election, even legacy candidates with a relatively weak inherited incumbency advantage will be advantaged within the selection process. A second important institutional variable, I argue, is the nature of the candidate selection process. Candidate selection can either be centralized within a party at the national level, so the national leadership in the headquarters in Tokyo, say, decides who the candidates are going to be, or it can be decentralized, so each local party branch in each district decides who their candidate will be in that district. And I argue that decentralized candidate selection reduces the ability for party leaders to pursue their nationally oriented goals in candidate selection. And if national party leaders cannot control the nomination process, then dynasties can dominate local decision-making processes in candidate selection. Just to outline what I'll talk about in the rest of today's presentation, I'm going to give an overview of the empirical record in Japan. This is in Chapter 2 of the book. I'm going to outline in more detail my theory of dynastic candidate selection. This is Chapter 3. And then the book has 3 core empirical chapters that evaluate the inherited advantages of dynastic ties for selection, getting nominated to run for office, election, so once you're actually a candidate running, what are the advantages to being a dynastic candidate, and promotion, getting selected for higher positions in the party or more specifically in the cabinet, and how these advantages differ across institutional contexts. Finally, Chapter 7 looks at the consequences of dynastic politics for democracy. Brief introduction to my data. The data set I use is an original data set, the Japanese House of Representatives elections data set. It includes all candidates in all elections and by-elections since 1947. I'm in the process of updating it now for the election from last Sunday. But in the data used in the book, there are over 27,000 observations on over 10,000 individual candidates. And I have detailed biographical information on the family ties of candidates to other candidates, including candidates who lost, who weren't elected and become MPs. The second data set I use is the Dynasties and Democracies data set. This is also an original data set that includes MP level, legislator-level data for 12 democracies, over 130,000 MP year observations, and it codes relationships between elected MPs. So it doesn't code relationships to candidates who never won. They don't show up in the data. The Japanese data do have relationships to candidates who never won. Okay, here's the empirical trend over time in the proportion of legacy candidates and MPs. You can see that they sort of track each other over time, and then there's a sort of splitting that happens in the 1990s around the time of the electoral reform. The difference between candidates and MPs suggests that there is some advantage, that there are more legacy MPs as a proportion than there are legacy candidates, which means a greater proportion of them are being elected. If we look across party, this is called a mosaic plot. Essentially, it plots a bivariate distribution, 2 different variables. So on the x-axis here, you see the fraction of by-party affiliation. So you can see the LDP is by far the largest party over the history of Japan. Smaller parties have smaller share of the fraction on the y-axis. The x-axis. The y-axis is the fraction of members of the party that are legacies, that are dynastic politicians. And you can see here too, the LDP has the largest share of dynastic members within their party. Some of the parties that are in this others categories are breakaway parties like the New Liberal Club in the 1980s, who were formed by LDP politicians, so it's not surprising that they would have similar characteristics as the LDP. Are these politicians simply the best butter of Japanese politics? Is it not that there's some kind of institutional reason for their being advantaged, but that they are very skilled, highly educated, wealthy members of society, and that Japan is actually selecting on good qualities by choosing dynastic politicians. This goes back to an argument that Stephen Hess made in the 1960s about American dynasties, saying that they are the best butter of American politics. They're old stock, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, professional, Eastern Seaboard, well-to-do. So there might be a Japanese equivalent to this kind of elite of society that we can try to tease out. What are the basic characteristics then of members of Japanese dynasties? We can look at geographic variation. This pools all MPs in the entire data set from 1947 to 2014 by prefecture. So darker areas are prefectures where the share of dynastic MPs has been higher in the post-war period. Lighter prefectures are areas where the share of dynastic MPs has been lower. You can see there are a few outliers. So Yamaguchi Prefecture, some of you might know, is where the Abe dynasty is from. Right now, I think all four of the representatives in Yamaguchi Prefecture are dynastic families, including Abe and his brother next door in another district. Shimane Prefecture was dominated for a long time by the Takeshita dynasty. There's Prime Minister Takeshita here. But part of the reason why these two prefectures appear dark is because the members of those dynasties were constantly representing the prefecture for the entire time period. So it's not that there are lots and lots of dynasties, it's just that you have the same person over time representing the area. And that's also true for the areas where there have been fewer dynasties. It's because you have an incumbent who is not dynastic, who is reelected many, many times, and so the share is lower. So not really any important patterns in geographic variation. How about age or gender? Well, legacies tend to enter parliament at a younger age. It's not surprising that because of their name recognition and their advantages, they're able to get elected despite having less experience. They also tend to be more likely than non-legacies to be women. So women in general face disadvantages in politics, but if you're a dynastic woman, then you can overcome those disadvantages and get elected. So among all MPs, the share of women is higher among legacy MPs, and among legacy MPs, the share of women is higher than male legacy MPs. If we look at prior experience, legacy MPs are less likely to have served in local office. They can often skip that step of a political career and run straight for national office. But they're more likely to have served as their father's secretary before running. So they have experience in different ways. Okay. How about education? There aren't any major differences in education between legacies and non-legacies. They're not necessarily more educated, but they are, or they do appear to be more likely to have attended a private university rather than a public university. So maybe there are some wealth differences between legacies and non-legacies. We can actually explore those with data on declared wealth of elected MPs. If we look at the mean here with all candidates or just the LDP, we can see that legacy MPs do tend to have more money on average, more wealth than non-legacy MPs. But part of this is because of really wealthy individuals like, here's Sasagawa, whose father, Sasakawa Ryoichi, was the founder of Nippon Foundation, a billionaire from speedboat racing, and former Prime Minister Aso Taro, whose family is a very wealthy family in Fukuoka in the mining industry. If we take these outliers out, or if we look at the median, then the wealth differences actually aren't so stark between non-legacy MPs and legacy MPs. This shows up too if we look at a box plot. There are some extreme outliers up here. If we drop the outliers, then actually a lot of legacy MPs are more poor than legacy MPs. So it's not clear that there's any real wealth difference that can explain the advantages of dynastic candidates in Japan. And we can come up with a few stylized facts. So legacies are not geographically concentrated. They tend to enter politics at a younger age. They're more likely to be women. Both of those attributes, in general, should be a disadvantage in Japanese politics. Young people don't tend to do very well, and women don't tend to do very well. But legacy candidates tend to exhibit those characteristics disproportionately more than non-legacy candidates. They're less likely to enter politics vertically through local assembly experience. They're not better educated, but more likely to have attended private universities, and they're not universally more wealthy. So it's not simply that Japanese legacy politicians are the best butter in political life, and that's why there are so many of them. We can also look at other occupations to rule out the idea that this maybe is a cultural thing, that in Japan, dentists' sons are more likely to become dentists than dentist sons in other countries. So this is the social stratification and mobility surveys that have been held every 10 years since 1955. And in general, there's been a decline in the share of sons who report having the same occupation as their father or occupation within the same field. If anything, there's been an increase in the last 2 decades in sons who have the same field as their father. And at the same time, among politicians, we see the exact opposite trend, that we saw there was an increase over time and then a decrease in the last 2 decades. So it can't be explained by broader trends in Japanese society. So what's my theory? Why do dynasties emerge and survive in democracies? I argue that there are some candidate-level factors that can explain the emergence of a dynastic candidate or a legacy candidate, including the incumbency advantage of the predecessor. How strong was the predecessor when he or she retired? There is an existing literature from the United States that argues that this incumbency advantage should be beneficial for, or the inherited incumbency advantage should be beneficial for a new dynastic candidate. And there's also a theory that power begets power, so that simply being in office longer means that there's more power accrued by the senior member of a dynasty that the junior member of a potential dynasty could then enjoy. But this doesn't explain the system-level differences across parties and countries. If the idea is simply that power begets power, then long-serving incumbents in all democracies and all parties should be able to accrue power that would be beneficial for their children. And yet we see variation across parties and across countries. So the simplicity of the power begets power argument doesn't really work when you think comparatively. This is a stylized model of the process of candidate selection that comes from a book edited by Pippa Norris that kind of explains in picture form how I'm going to approach theory through supply and demand incentives. So if we think of candidate selection as an outcome, it's influenced both by the supply of aspirants. You can only select candidates who actually want to become candidates, so people who come forward, or the demands of gatekeepers. Some of those candidates who come forward will be encouraged to run. Some people who come forward will be rejected by gatekeepers. And these operate in tandem at the candidate selection stage. But they're also influenced by institutional factors that are sort of higher up at higher levels in the system. So one is the candidate selection process. What are the rules and procedures for picking candidates? And that is in turn possibly affected by the legal system, the electoral system, and the party system. So it's kind of like a funnel of causality resulting in the final outcome of who gets selected as a candidate. Okay? So on the supply side, we can have a first hypothesis that long-serving incumbents will be more likely to have a family member who themselves wants to follow in their footsteps and run for office. So they become an aspirant for office. One way we can get at this general supply side hypothesis is looking at the length of tenure of incumbents and the probability that they will have a future family member in office. So do incumbents who serve longer, are they more likely to have a family member also enter politics in the future? If we look at that in a simple estimation framework where the outcome variable is the having a future family member, being a senior member of a dynasty, just as a binary outcome, and we estimate the predicted probability that one will become a senior member of a dynasty by number of terms served at the time that you retire or die. We can see that there's an increasing probability across nearly all countries of becoming a senior member of a dynasty the longer you serve in office. So this suggests that there's some supply side explanation where people who serve longer are more likely to have a children or other relative follow them into office. But we also see that the point at which the predicted line crosses the y-axis varies across countries. So in Ireland, for example, even MPs who serve relatively short terms have a higher than 10% probability of having a family member serve in the future. And in Japan, it's about 5%, even if you serve only a few number of terms, whereas in Germany, it's always pretty low. Most other countries, it doesn't reach those kind of levels until you get up to 10 plus terms. Okay? A second supply-side hypothesis is that incumbents who are part of an existing dynasty will be more likely to have a family member who wants to follow them into office. And we can look at this by splitting our sample into those incumbents who retire and were themselves already part of a dynasty versus those incumbents who retire and were not part of a dynasty. And across all countries, existing legacy MPs are more likely to also have a family member run in the future than non-legacy MPs who retire. So there is some continuation of family politics. If we look at the demand side, this is where our institutional variables come in. So in most democracies, parties make nomination decisions. They evaluate candidates before they give them a nomination, and they select them on characteristics that will help them balance their goals of enacting policies they prefer, maintaining their hold on office, and getting votes in election time. Okay? But these nomination decisions are made within the context of institutions, especially electoral systems, and the party recruitment processes. So my major question here is, do these system-level factors generate varying incentives for parties to have higher demand or less or lower demand for legacy candidates? So how do electoral systems then shape party incentives in candidate selection? We can illustrate this with kind of a simple example. So if you were thinking about a candidate-centered election, it's going to generate incentives to cultivate a personal vote. And so strong personal vote earning attributes, including dynastic ties, should be valuable. These personal vote earning attributes should become less valuable in elections where votes are cast for a party rather than for a candidate. So if you're casting your vote for a party, it matters less what the attributes of the individual candidates are. So consider, so the hypothesis here would be the demand for legacy candidate will be higher in candidate-centered electoral contexts than in party-centered electoral contexts. So consider a simple choice between two parties, and you're asked to vote for one party. And this is a first-past-the-post plurality rule single-member district contest like we have in the US. If you're given a choice between a donkey and an elephant, on which criteria would voters base their decision? Well, if they only know donkey and elephant, then they're going to base their characteristics or their vote choice on what they know about those two parties. They know nothing about the candidate. Suppose now you give some more information about candidates, and you have John Doe, who's a Democrat, and Don Joe, who's a Republican. Well, in this case, voters don't really have that much more information. They have two generic-looking middle-aged white men. They still only know the party label, and so it's likely that party label will still be the most important factor in their vote decision. But suppose we now know that John Doe is an incumbent, and he was born in the district, and Don Joe is a challenger, doesn't have any experience, and is from outside the district, is a parachute candidate. Then maybe some voters who are less devoted to either one of the parties will consider those personal characteristics, and in that case, maybe John Doe has an advantage because he's local and he has experience. Now consider John Hamm. John Hamm has name recognition. So there are some people who are going to see John Hamm as a candidate and choose him because they've heard of John Hamm, regardless of which party label he's running under. So this is an example of how personal vote earning attributes, PVEA, can be beneficial under first-past-the-post single-member districts, but there's also some advantage of having a good party label that people are familiar with. If the Republican Party in this case were running Don Draper, then maybe that name recognition is less relevant. This may be a dated reference for TV shows. Now consider Japan's pre-1994 electoral rules. This is single non-transferable vote in multi-member districts. So any party that wanted to win a majority of seats, like the LDP, would need to nominate multiple candidates in that district. This created intra-party competition. So if you're a voter, you can't just say, I like the LDP or I like the Donkey Party. You have to determine which among the many candidates running under the party label you also like. So this creates a need to find out more about the individual candidates who are running, and things like name recognition and personal attributes are going to matter more under this system relative to the first-past-the-post system. A party label alone is no longer a valuable piece of information. Okay. Under closed-list PR, which is what Japan has used in one tier of its electoral system since the 1990s, the list leader maybe is important, because if you're thinking about who might become a future leader in the party, then whoever's at the top of the list is likely to get elected. You might pay attention to who they are. But as you go down the list, candidates are going to be less important. The exception is if you're a voter and you see a list where all the candidates look the same, maybe that doesn't look very attractive to you. Maybe you'd rather have a list where there's some diversity, there's some differences in age or race or gender. I can't say that this is the case for the most recent election in Japan, where for the LDP, only 8% of their candidates were women. It was mostly a list of men. But most parties would understand that providing a list that looks like a bunch of candidates who are the same may earn you less votes than having a more diversified list where voters can say, oh, this party represents a wider swath of the public. Okay? So how does it make a difference beyond electoral rules, how candidates are selected, what the candidate selection rules are? A decentralized candidate selection process may favor local notables, but a centralized process will allow national party leaders to pursue their image goals in candidate selection, such as having a more diverse candidate list with more young people and women, or policy experts. And a party full of legacy MPs, a party full of legacy candidates, is not a very good image for a party. So a fourth hypothesis is that the demand for a legacy candidate should be higher where the candidate selection process and decision are decentralized to local actors, lower when the party leadership has control and is thinking about their national party image and goals. Okay, I'm going to get into the empirics now for Japan. So on the selection dimension, one of my questions in the book is which types of politicians will be more likely to be followed into office by a family member, and which institutions are associated with more legacy candidates. I used Japan as a case because there was an electoral reform in 1994 that shifted politics from this candidate-centered, intra-party competition-dominant SNTV multi-member district system to a mixed system that combined first-past-the-post single-member districts and closed-list PR, both of which should incentivize more of a focus on party label and less of a focus on individual candidate characteristics. Okay? So there's a previously high level of intra-party competition, particularly within the LDP. It was highly personalized, highly localized, and candidate-centered elections. And campaigns were run on the basis or through the vehicle of koenkai, personal support groups of each candidate, not through a party organization. And those koenkai played a major role in determining who would be a successor when a candidate retired or died, not the party organization. Okay? If we look across parties in the pre-reform period, this is from 1958 to 1993, we see that the share of legacies and the darker purple bar, hereditary subset of legacies, increased over time in the LDP, but also within the JSP and the DSP, fewer within Komeito, and none in the Communist Party. After electoral reform, Japan uses this mixed system, combining single-member districts and closed-list PR. There's no more intra-party competition, and this reform was expected to produce more party-centered elections and more policy-centered elections, as well as two-party competition. Most LDP candidates can be listed in a single-member district contest and on the party list, and this mitigates the winner-take-all nature of the single-member district contests and allows parties to nominate underrepresented types of candidates like women with less electoral risk. And the parties have adapted in turn. So I'm going to give a few case study examples of how the LDP has adapted. By 2003, this reform did indeed produce party-centered elections. Parties were producing manifestos prior to elections that focused on policies rather than the individuals running in their district. The DPJ emerged as a challenger in a largely two-party system from 2003. This later fell apart in 2012. And the DPJ had a tendency to nominate new and talented candidates, many of whom had been passed over by the LDP for nomination in favor of a legacy candidate. So in 2004, the LDP responded to this new threat from the LDP with party reforms. They increased the role of the party leadership in candidate selection. They introduced a system of open recruitment contests for determining who would get a nomination. Prime Minister Koizumi expelled former rebels who voted against his postal privatization initiative in 2005. And the party sought to create a fresh, new reformist image. One of the ways in which this was manifested was in the nomination of new candidates who are women. So if you look over time, here's electoral reform, the dashed line in 1994. Most of the candidates who are running, who make up these purple bars before electoral reform, were from the Communist Party or the Socialist Party. After electoral reform, there are many more female candidates in all parties, including the DPJ, but the increase has been especially stark in the LDP. It's still not very high. It's less than 15%, but it has increased dramatically since electoral reform. In these few elections in the 1990s, the LDP nominated a total of 4 female candidates, and 3 of them were dynastic successors to their fathers. Okay. To give an example of some new non-legacy faces, this is Shibayama Masahiko, who was chosen in by-election in 2005. He was the first candidate chosen through this new recruitment system, Kobo. And he was not a dynastic candidate. He was a lawyer who was recruited into running, and they hired a PR specialist to help him craft his image, told him to stop wearing his glasses, told him to wear similar colors all the time, and he had a mascot, Shiba Wan, that was in his posters, and he won. And that gave the party encouragement to pursue these new selection processes in more races. In 2005, they nominated people like Dr. Inoguchi Kuniko, who is a PhD in political science from Yale. She was a former diplomat and was one of Koizumi's so-called children in 2005 that ran and won. She was nominated at the top of the Tokyo party list. So these types of candidates represent a new type of candidate that weren't the kind of old traditional paths to candidacy. So just to summarize how the reform should have affected Japanese politics, under the pre-reform electoral rules, elections were dominated by intra-party competition. It was candidate-centered, and there was a need for a strong personal vote-earning attribute. In the post-reform period, there's no longer any intra-party competition. It's more party-centered, and the dual listing procedure across tiers mitigates the risk of nominating diverse types. In terms of candidate selection, it was previously decentralized. The Koenkai were dominant in picking new candidates, and local elites could co-opt the process and dominate who got chosen. Now it's more centralized, especially in the DPJ. The party is more dominant, and the open recruitment process expands the choice of candidates for party to choose from. So how would these changes affect dynastic politics? The first expectation is that legacy candidates should decrease under the party-centered system, especially in the closed list PR tier. A second expectation is that legacy candidates should further decrease after the party reforms in 2004. And a third expectation is that weaker incumbents should be less likely to be succeeded under these new rules. That even if supply has stayed constant, there should be lower demand now for the children of weaker incumbents when they leave office. Just to show some data here, these are the trends over time. So in terms of all candidates, you can see after electoral reform, again, the dashed line here, there's an immediate drop in the proportion of legacy candidates in the LDP. And this is the DPJ in white here. But this is masking the fact that a lot of incumbents were still running, and of course they're going to run again. If we look at new candidates, first-time candidates only, in the pre-reform period, in the last 7 elections of pre-reform period, at times 50% of the candidates were dynastic. That's quite high. Flip a coin and the LDP candidate would be dynastic. Since electoral reform, the share of new candidates has fluctuated, but in some elections it's been less than 10% in 2009, 2012, and that's actually in line with most other developed democracies, 10% or less. So it looks like Japan is becoming more like other democracies in terms of its patterns of dynastic politics. This is across electoral institutions, and it's, again, a mosaic plot. So under SNTV, MMD, just over a quarter of new LDP candidates were hereditary, and the purple here are legacy candidates who were not hereditary, but almost 50% of all candidates, new candidates, were either legacy candidates who weren't hereditary or hereditary candidates. Under the first past the post system up until 2004, there's been a further drop after reform in 2005, particularly among hereditary candidates. And then there are no hereditary candidates in closed list PR because there's no district to inherit, but there are fewer legacy candidates in general. So this supports the idea that these electoral systems that de-emphasize personal vote earning attributes and put more focus on parties, as well as reforms that strengthen the party's hand in candidate selection, are correlated with reduction in the number of legacies that a party nominates. Okay. I want to give some time. So an important question is that maybe it's not that parties have changed their behavior, but the different types of candidates are retiring, or different types of incumbents are retiring before or after reform. So we're seeing the things that we're seeing because the people who are retiring are weaker, or that previously a certain type of candidate who was more predisposed to form a dynasty was retiring, and now those candidates are not retiring in the same rate. So the way we can look at this is by finding candidates who have similar characteristics and saying, okay, what's the probability that a candidate with a similar characteristic who retires pre-reform is succeeded, and compare that to the probability that a candidate with those same characteristics is succeeded in the post-reform period. And if there's a difference, then that indicates that there's a change in demand, not a change in supply. So we can do this a number of ways. I want to just skip through the empirics, quickly. This shows, if we're looking at the number of prior wins as the main independent variable, and we're trying to predict the probability that a candidate will be succeeded in the next election when he or she retires. This plots in the light gray that relationship in the pre-reform period, in the most recent 7 elections of the pre-reform period. And the dark plot is for the most recent 7 elections under the new electoral system. And what you see is that there's a lot of overlap in confidence intervals, but there's a higher probability of being succeeded at lower levels of seniority under the old rules. And at higher levels of seniority, there's pretty much no difference. If anything, candidates with higher levels of seniority are more likely to be succeeded under the new rules. If we break it into quartiles, because then we have less noise within individual numbers. So looking at the SNTV period, candidates who had 2 or fewer wins had about a 13% probability of being succeeded, even though they'd only served 2 terms. In the most recent period under first past the post, after party reforms, that's less than 5%. And it's a statistically significant drop in the probability of having a future family member in office. At the higher levels of seniority, though, the confidence intervals are overlapping. And if anything, candidates are more likely to be succeeded if their fathers served longer or their predecessors served longer in office. So just to sort of highlight these substantive findings, outgoing LDP candidates with average number of wins, 5 in the last 7 years under the pre-reform period, had a predicted probability of succession, having a family member succeed them in the same district, of 20%. But an outgoing LDP candidate with the same number of wins, 5 wins in the first 7 elections under the new reform, has a lower predicted probability of succession, just 13%. So there has been an effect on the median or mean candidate and candidates with less experience, but similar probabilities for candidates with longer tenures, and fewer legacy candidates among closed-list PR candidates. So what's going on? I argue that there are some aspects of continuity. There's some path dependence. There's a continued supply of legacy candidates whose predecessors were first elected under the old system. They've been waiting to run. They've been serving as their father's secretary for a decade or more. And they're going to run whether the party asks them to or not. The most recent example of this is in Fukuoka, I think it's 4th district. After Hatoyama Kunio died, there was competition for getting the LDP nomination between his son, Jiro, who was already a local politician, and another local politician in Fukuoka Prefecture. And ultimately, the son got the nomination because if he had been denied the nomination, he was going to run anyway, and the LDP would have split their vote and probably would have lost the by-election or the election on Sunday. Let me just skip over this because we're running short on time. This hints at that supply-side continuity. So this is a survey that asked incumbent MPs what their attitudes were towards hereditary succession. Should it be prohibited or should it be allowed? And if we look at all candidates, almost 80% of candidates who were non-legacy candidates said it should be restricted. Those who were themselves legacy or hereditary had a lower share who were in support of restricting hereditary succession. But if we look within the LDP and we divide it by those who were non-legacy who weren't currently employing a member of the family as their secretary, and compare it to those who were legacy or hereditary who were currently employing a member of their family as a secretary, the support for restriction goes down considerably. So among the incumbents who had a family member waiting in the wings wanting to run, the support for restricting hereditary succession was decreased. That suggests that there's some resistance within the LDP to reforms that prevent the family from spreading their dynasty. Okay, I think are we okay on time? 5 minutes, okay. I want to skip over election. Long story short, members of dynasties do better in elections, but voters don't like them. So this is sort of a puzzle. If voters don't like dynasties, why do they do better in elections? The answer is that the name recognition helps them to get nominated and helps them to get elected, and also that they tend to run in places where the LDP is going to win anyway. So the LDP is strong in certain districts. It doesn't matter whether you nominate a legacy candidate or a non-legacy candidate, the LDP candidate is going to win regardless. But if you ask voters, should hereditary candidate or hereditary succession be restricted, many of them say that a surprisingly large share, 20%, say that it should be banned, which is kind of odd. You think democracy shouldn't say that you should ban any type of candidate from the freedom to run if they want to run. But there were enough voters who felt strongly about hereditary politicians being bad that they wanted to ban them. And then another almost 20% who said they felt close to that position. If you ask voters how they feel about common types of backgrounds among politicians in Japan, hereditary politicians are about as unpopular as celebrity talento politicians. National bureaucrats and local politicians have a little bit more support. This is a conjoint survey. I'll skip that. Okay, promotion. So another question is, are legacy MPs more advantaged in terms of getting promoted into cabinet? And does the advantage vary by a family's history in cabinet? Okay, or by the institutional context? This plots the share of legacy MPs among cabinet ministers and the share among LDP MPs. And so any bar that's above the line means that the share of MPs in the cabinet who are legacies is higher than the share within the party. So it's overrepresentation of legacies in the cabinet relative to their share in the party. This drop here is when the DPJ government was in power. LDP was founded in 1955. This is when seniority rule was introduced in the late 1960s, and you can see that overrepresentation went away because people weren't being promoted on the basis of their characteristics. It was more routine based on their seniority. This is the first period out of government, and again, that's the second period out of government when the DPJ was in power. To take an example, this is the first cabinet of Aso Taro in 2008. Aso himself is a legacy MP. So are all of these cabinet ministers. So 12 of 18 members of the House of Representatives who served in cabinet, 67% of the cabinet were dynastic, even though the LDP in parliament was only about 30% dynastic. Here's the second cabinet of Abe Shinzo. Abe is, of course, a dynastic MP. This is fun. 56% of the Abe second cabinet. And here's from last summer, Abe again. Whoops. 47%. So a little bit lower, but still an overrepresentation of dynasties within the cabinet relative to their population in the party. Why might this be? There might be two explanations for that. One is that being a legacy directly contributes to the probability that you're going to get appointed to cabinet. It could be informational advantages or some other network advantages. Another explanation is that it operates through a mediator of the electoral advantage. So if you're a legacy candidate, you're more likely to get elected and re-elected in your district, and so you have higher seniority within the party, and that's what that's what gets you overrepresentation within the cabinet. Okay, we can look at that through a series of regressions, and by splitting candidates into two different types. So theoretically, in the book, I argued that there are actually two types of dynasties. There are regular dynasties who are successful in their electoral districts and keep running and winning. And then there are sort of higher level dynasties like the Hatoyamas. In the American context, it would be the Kennedys and the Bushes and the Clintons, whose families have a history not just in parliament, but also in high level leadership positions in cabinet. And so I call these cabinet legacies because they maybe have an informational advantage with what it takes to get promoted into cabinet, network advantages with the party leadership, and so on. If we split the sample into these two types of dynasties, those whose predecessors have served in cabinet before them and those whose predecessors have never served in cabinet, then we might expect that cabinet legacies should have an advantage relative to not just non-legacies, but non-cabinet legacies, so the other types of legacies. Even controlling for seniority. But we might also expect this advantage to decline in the period after the 1960s when seniority rule was introduced. Okay? So this is just the results by time period. I'll go over them quickly, and then I think I'm running out of time. In the occupation era up to 1955, non-cabinet legacies had a slight advantage. Cabinet legacies had a larger advantage. When you control for seniority, those advantages are slightly smaller, but they're still there. In the early 1955 system, before the introduction of seniority rule, cabinet legacy MPs enjoy an advantage and still enjoy a slight advantage even when you control for seniority. Here's the period under seniority rule. If anything, there's a disadvantage for cabinet legacies without controlling for seniority and no apparent advantage when you control for seniority, but you do see the effect of seniority where members with 5 and higher terms are more likely to get promoted to cabinet during that period. And this is the post-reform era under Abe and Aso and others. There's a clear advantage when you don't control for anything for both types of legacies. When you control for the family history in cabinet, non-cabinet legacies no longer have advantage. It's only cabinet legacies. It's only people like Abe and Aso, whose predecessors also served in cabinet, who are more likely to get promoted to cabinet in the post-reform period. Okay, so what? What are the potential consequences of dynastic politics? There could be some negative effects. There could be some adverse selection, that lower quality legacy candidates are more likely to be selected than non-legacy candidates because they have fewer barriers to entry. So if you're a non-legacy candidate, you have to be really, really good in order to win. There may also be some moral hazard issues. If legacy candidates are electorally insulated, then they can do whatever they want and without fear of being kicked out of office. But there might also be some positive effects. So legacy candidates and politicians may be better or more familiar with politics and political norms. They can hit the ground running when they're elected. They're more experienced. They may also exhibit a continuity and representational style for their constituents in the district. They talk about similar things as their predecessors. And also, dynastic politics can facilitate gender representation in places that are otherwise male-dominated. So if we look across countries, this is the share of female MPs and male MPs who are dynastic. The purple line is much higher over time than the dotted green line. That just means that women are more likely to be dynastic, at least initially. Over time, that gap decreases because women are able to break the glass ceiling and enter into politics. They no longer need the dynastic tie to get elected. So this shows breaking into 2 different time periods, from 1945 to 1980 and 1980 to 2016. This bias, this dynastic gap between men and women as MPs tends to decline. And that may be a positive thing for democracy, at least in places where women are underrepresented. On the flip side, if you pick electoral institutions like closed list PR, the cross-national evidence shows that that's better for gender representation anyway. So that would be a solution for increasing gender representation that doesn't have to use this workaround through dynastic channels to get elected. Okay, I've spoken a lot about a lot of things. Just to kind of wrap up and conclude, the system-level context of electoral rules and candidate selection procedures contribute to dynastic politics in Japan and elsewhere. Dynastic candidate selection declines when a candidate's personal vote matters less and when parties take a more centralized role in candidate selection. And this is despite the fact that legacy candidates enjoy an electoral advantage in elections across all contexts. But this selection has differed depending on the context. In the case of Japan, only cabinet legacies appear to enjoy an advantage in promotion to cabinet. And so in the context of Japan, we might think this is positive news, that there used to be lots and lots of dynasties, and they were rampant in Japan and overrepresented, and Japan looked like an outlier. In the most recent elections, the share of new dynastic candidates has decreased to 10% or fewer, which is about in line with most other developed democracies, whereas it used to be about half of all new candidates were dynastic in the LDP. And those candidates who are tending to run now are most like the candidates who run in other countries, like Kennedy's and Bush's, who are going to run regardless. And if the evidence on promotion to cabinet and other variables that are in the book are to be believed, these types of long-term dynasties, the cabinet legacies, may have more positive behavioral aspects than the sort of entrenched local elites who just keep running and winning without ever moving up in the ranks of the party. So it looks like Japan is headed towards patterns that are more like the US and Canada and other democracies from a baseline starting point of an extreme outlier in terms of dynasties. So I'll leave it there and take the questions.
We have 10 minutes, 15 minutes for Q&A questions. Raise your hand and get your microphone.
Hi. Hi, thank you for your talk. It was like really fascinating. I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
First, do you see this incumbent advantage as being like cumulative, as in like in the future, third, fourth generation, will there be more advantage?
Mm-hmm.
And second, like on the concrete policy level,
Mm-hmm.
do you think this introduced some continuity or at least like predictability to concrete policy initiatives and stuff?
Yeah. Good question. So let's see if I have. So I skipped over this in the presentation, but in the chapter on electoral advantages, in the pre-reform period, I'm able to control for the length of time that the family has controlled their jiban, their personal support base in a district, and so if you don't control for the strength of the jiban, which can be inherited by either a hereditary successor or a non-hereditary successor. So sometimes a secretary who's not related will inherit a jiban, or a bureaucrat will, there are rumors that they purchased the jiban, but will get to inherit the koenkai and the jiban from a incumbent who retires. And they're not related at all. So they have no blood relation or name recognition or anything like that, but they inherit the machinery. So they can hit the ground running with the koenkai intact. If we don't control for the strength of the jiban, the number of times that jiban has won election, then hereditary successors do much better than non-hereditary successors. So the baseline group in this particular analysis is a non-legacy successor in the LDP. If we control for the strength of the jiban and whether the predecessor won their election, then that advantage disappears. So part of the argument I make in the book is that these legacy candidates or hereditary candidates are inheriting an operation, a machine, and a non-legacy candidate could inherit that same machine and still win. And when you switch from the pre-reform period to the post-reform period, it's no longer these personal machines, it's the party. The party is a machine. So the party has an organization at the district level, and it doesn't matter who you nominate to be the party's candidate in the single-member district contest. They're going to do as well as that party's candidate would do, regardless of their personal characteristics. Second question, maybe I didn't answer. Did I?
Yeah, was like the second question was, does that introduce continuity or?
Oh, so I've looked at the candidate manifestos. So Senkyo Koho, every election candidates put out in a newspaper a brief statement of their policy positions. And you can actually use text analysis methods to evaluate how similar two different documents are. And what I find is that comparing a previous incumbent and a hereditary successor, and a previous incumbent and a non-hereditary successor, the two documents are much more similar when it's a hereditary successor. So there's some evidence of continuity in the style of representation, what types of policies are talked about, and that's vis-a-vis the voters. So voters are maybe getting some continuity in representational style through dynastic politics.
Hi. So just to kind of compare with U.S. politics, media plays like a huge part here when it comes to elections. Do you see kind of a trend with dynastic politics being implemented in the media through like TV and other like campaigns, and does that help or usually hurt the dynastic
in Japan?
candidates? Yeah.
So in the 2009 election, being a dynastic candidate was somewhat controversial if you were an LDP candidate, because they were attacked and targeted by the DPJ. The DPJ was going to do well in that election. So the only new dynastic candidate that was nominated, there were two hereditary successors nominated in 2009. One was Koizumi Shinjiro, and he wins with 75% of the vote in his district, so nothing is going to affect what happens to him. So it's hard to say whether the media currently or has in the past shaped the public's perception of dynastic politicians. In the journalistic accounts of dynastic politics that are published in Japan, the tone is entirely negative. So one thing I've tried to do is consider both sides and paint a more objective picture of what dynastic politics does for Japanese politics more generally.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the talk.
Oh.
Hi.
Hi.
I've got two questions. I think the first one is a yes or no, so I'm not trying to burden you.
Okay.
You made such a wonderfully strong case that this is potentially really helpful for female candidates.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible, thank you for laughing at that. Do female candidates then often pass that legacy on to their children? So, i.e., does it only help them, or do they have power enough to also have their kids elected? That I hope is a yes or no question. The more hopefully complicated question is, how do we define relations here?
Mm-hmm.
Is it just genetic relations, or is it also by marriage and specifically adoption is what I'm thinking about?
Right. So those are both good questions. The short answer for the first question is that there isn't enough time in any of my countries to see any substantial senior members of dynasties who are women who pass to junior family. Most women who have any kind of dynastic relation are the junior members who are related to a male predecessor. One thing that I do see across a bunch of countries is that women who enter politics through the dynastic channel in earlier years tend to be widows or wives, and in more recent years they tend to be daughters. And so what that suggests is that when they first come in, somebody's asking them to run in like a by-election, saying we need a stand-in warm body, and you've got the name. But in more recent elections, the daughters are selecting in to a career in politics themselves. So that maybe is encouraging for equality in the gender connection to dynasties. On the second question, the second question was
Is it just genetics, or is it also marriage?
Right. So I do have. So all types of family ties, marriage and blood, are included in the sort of base measure, but you can actually disaggregate them in my data. And one thing that I find is that sons-in-law tend to be better at winning than sons. And the way I interpret that is that just like dentists' sons might want to become dentists and doctors' sons might want to become doctors, there are some sons who are going to want to follow in their father's footsteps who aren't actually very good. And so they might lose. But the other way to look at it is that if you have a distant male relative, so a nephew or a son-in-law or a grandnephew, they're probably not running because they really want to follow in their male relative's footsteps. They're being they're being recruited in to run. And that usually happens because the incumbent who retires is a powerful incumbent. And they thought they want to keep that machine going. And so there's some interaction there between supply and demand and the type of dynastic candidate who's either going to be selecting in or being recruited in to run. Mm-hmm.
Hi, you've mentioned that personal vote and localized candidate nomination partly contribute to this dynastic politics. But I want to take a further step to ask, so why Japan is particularly susceptible to this personal vote or Koan-Kai tradition? So is that all about election system or culture?
Yeah, so I argue that it was the pre-reform electoral system, the multi-member district system with a single non-transferable vote, which for the LDP meant that the party had to nominate more than one candidate. And so that creates intra-party competition, and the value of the party label is decreased for voters. So they have to cast their vote based on the individual candidate's personal characteristics. When they switch to first-past-the-post, single-member district races, now each party only has one candidate. So for many voters, they can just base their choice on whether they like the party or not whether they like one of the candidates who are running under the same party label. So I definitely argue that it was the institutions. It wasn't anything cultural or historical about Japan that resulted in an increase over time in dynasties. It was the institutions that created that increase. And when you remove those institutions, change those institutions, now we're starting to see the decrease in the dynastic politics.
Maybe one last quick question.
I was just curious, you said that if there are hereditary what type of, have other countries adopted that? How would that be implemented?
So it's a good question. So Indonesia tried to prohibit dynastic candidates from running, and the Supreme Court overruled it. They said you can't do that, which makes sense. The only way to prohibit it legally in most countries would be as an internal party rule. So parties are private organizations that can nominate whatever candidates they want and can have whatever rule they want. So the DPJ adopted a internal party rule that they wouldn't nominate any hereditary candidate, but it would be against most countries' legal system rules to say that across the board no legacy candidate can run.
Great, thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Professor Smith.
Thank you.